Okay. Okay, so last week we talked about what it means to be adulterers or cheaters. And James, asked us that hard question, or forced us into asking that hard question about ourselves, why we do the things we do and act the way we act and watch the thing we watch and listen to what we listen to and why are we investing in relationships that we're investing in. So he forced us into analyzing our lives and asking if those things are for God or if they're for us or the world. So yeah, we need to be vulnerable with that and be willing to be harsh and honest with those why questions. So we carry on this week with the follow-up to that. So James chapter 4, verses 5 through 10. I suppose I'll start at 4 just so we have the full thought here. You adulterers, don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? I say it again. If you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. What do you think the scriptures mean when they say that the Spirit of God that God has placed within us is filled with envy? But he gives us even more grace to stand against such evil desires. As the scriptures say, God opposes the proud, but favors the humble. So humble yourselves before God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come close to God, and God will come close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world. Let there be tears for what you have done. Let there be sorrow and deep grief. Let there be sadness instead of laughter and gloom instead of joy. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up in honor. Does anyone mind getting me a glass of water? I'm going to need it. Thank you. So what does this mean? James is wrapping up the thought here, this complete thought of the tension we face as believers and how we cope with it. It's the follow-up to those why questions that we're asking and how godly wisdom would deal with it going forward. Pride distances us from God because it hardens our hearts to him. Literally, if you look up the Greek word used here for pride, forgive my pronunciation, antistaphi, means to resist. The war being waged is taking place on our heart. James tells us exactly what it looks like if we are really seeking unity with God rather than the world. Thank you. Wow, that's a huge glass. Where was I? And he wraps it up with one behavior, humility, being humble. Thanks. He says, God opposes the proud but favors the humble. Humility in opposition to pride. So, let's look back. Let's look back in history here for some examples of how pride played out and the consequences that came to bear for people in the past. This has come in the form of like an attitude or behavior, or in the form of like just directly rejecting or resisting. I'll use that word. Resisting God's will. So we have Jonah. Use Jonah as an example. Jonah was a prophet of God, and one day he's chilling, doing whatever he's doing, and God calls out to him and tells him to go into Assyria, Nineveh, and this is like a hotbed during Jonah's time. And he tells Jonah to go there and warn these people, basically. Warn the people that God knows what's up and what's going to come. So what does Jonah do? Does anybody know? Yeah. Jonah finds the closest ship and gets the heck out of there. So, this is an example of just a direct resistance or rejecting God's will. What happens? Jonah goes out to sea, and storm comes, and then the people that he's on the ship with, like throw him overboard, gets swallowed by a fish, and it's not looking good for Jonah. We'll touch back on Jonah a little later. But so you have Jonah. You have Peter. Peter was one of Christ's disciples. He was gung-ho. He talks about Peter walking on water because of his love and focus for Christ. And Peter is this super passionate guy for Christ. I'll go with you to the death. When they come to arrest Christ, he's so gung-ho that he cuts some dude's ear off. So you have Peter. But then what happens when people start asking Peter about Christ? I don't know him. I don't know him. I don't know him. 3 times Peter denies Christ because of his focusing on himself and his own pride and whatnot. So you have Peter reject. And that's an example of a behavioral thing or an attitude. You have the Jews. Jews are so focused on the law and on following the law that when Christ was with them, preaching and performing miracles and whatnot, even though that they were living with him, they still couldn't see what was right in front of them, and they ultimately killed him. I want to read. I always think about this passage. It's like one of the first passages I sort of clung to when I started, exploring Scripture and stuff. But Romans 1, if you guys want to turn to there, talks about this attitude, basically. I guess I'll start at verse 21 here. They knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. They began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they became utter fools instead. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshipped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. So God abandoned them to do whatever shameful things their hearts desired. As a result, they did vile and degrading things to each other. Yeah, and he goes on and he gets very specific with things that they did. But the point is there, these people knew God, and they knew what they were doing was wrong, but they were refusing to change, Chapter 2 goes on to talk about, it mentions it in chapter 1, but chapter 2 goes on to talk about what God does to those kinds of people. It says in chapter 1 that he abandons them, just like in this is earlier verse in chapter 4 of James here. It says that God's an enemy of these people. Chapter 1 of Romans says he abandons them. So these are some examples from Scripture of how pride is playing out. As firewalkers, we talk every week with you guys, Gio and Devin, wherever you are. We talk every week and Jeremiah, with them about attitudes and stuff and mistakes we've made and stuff to try and correct behaviors. We try and relate to them, but as good as that is for the firewalkers, it's not always enough, and they are like they need real life examples. It's not like tangible for them. It's like, oh, that happened in your life or whatever. So it's not always enough. We'll continue to do that for them, but they need more. So how do we see pride playing out in society today? At the end of my cell group last week, we, Josh and myself, sort of challenged you guys, those of you that were in my cell group, challenged you guys, but I don't know if that challenge didn't really stick or what, but how many of you guys got on the thread this week? Small handful that I can count on one fist. You guys, whether you got on or not, let me back up. You guys have struggled with, prioritizing this and being vulnerable in that way. But people, not just us, but people are not prioritizing God. That's an example of pride working out in society today. They're not in an active relationship with Him, and it's passive, and they don't prioritize it. They don't prioritize going to church, or, in our case, because we don't have a problem with attendance, but we're not prioritizing being critical of ourselves and being vulnerable so that we can grow together and stuff. So there's a pride that's taking place, I believe. And it says, it doesn't say, that resistance is something that hardens our hearts. You have these sayings that are floating around, I think about our last intense conversation with Brittany's parents, but her mom makes a comment like, "This is just who I am," or "You can't teach an old dog new tricks." I know Pastor likes to use that one, but honestly, that's pride. That's an unwillingness to grow or learn. And for the record, I don't believe you have an unwillingness to grow or learn, Pastor, but you do like to say that. That's why I pointed out. That's an unwillingness to grow or learn, and it's kind of BS. It's something that hardens our hearts. And if we're seeking to be close to God, like we're talking about in this chapter of James, if we're seeking to be close to God, then we need to not allow that type of behavior into our minds. We need to always be critical and analyzing ourselves and asking ourselves if what we're doing is in line with Christ. We see it in the form of social media and stuff. People have the ability to post about themselves, or post something seeking glory or whatever. There's the like button on Facebook, which is fun, but what is that? We have the selfie movement, which is horrible. But yeah, we have the selfie movement, which is something, again, that's just looking to emphasize yourself and focus on you instead of God. Why am I doing that? How is the selfie movement for God? Everyone knows I'm a sports guy, soccer specifically. But in sports, when you do something good, like score a goal or hit a home run or whatever you're doing, there's this borderline sacrilegious display that happens where people do this with their arms and lift their heads up and we eat that up. I do. I'm guilty of it. We praise these people and it's terrible. How is that humble? Sports is bad when it comes to that, seeking glory. So, yeah, those are a few examples of pride working out. We have churches who, like it's talking about in Romans, we have churches that are so willing to compromise, Scripture and what they know to be true, so that they can be modern or whatever, so that they can be accepted in today's society, based on whatever socio-political things going on. We've mentioned a few times how many different denominations are accepting of homosexuality now. It's and for what? So that people can justify their own moralities, for what they think is right or good, instead of seeing if it's in line with God. Yeah. So an unwillingness to prioritize, compromising what we know to be true. I mentioned sports. These are all the things that how it's playing out in society today, social media and just self-exaltation. So now that we have a better understanding of that, I want to look to the key point here, humility, or being humble. If pride, as we know from the Greek, and I encourage you to look it up, if pride means to resist, then it stands to reason that being humble is to submit to God. History shows us that there are some people who just get it, like you have Abraham, known for his faith. Abraham, is promised by God that he's going to have, all these descendants and they'll be his people. Abraham's told to go to a place. Abraham goes. Abraham's told to kill somebody, and he says, "Where's my knife?" These people, you have Daniel in Babylon, who, had multiple opportunities to take the glory for himself, interpreting dreams and whatnot. Had multiple opportunities to, lift himself up and give himself, this glory for these things he was doing. But what did Daniel do? Daniel, and his buddies for that matter, they always deferred to God. Before anything even happened, they sought God first, and then expressed that to the king or whoever. They were never looking to lift themselves up. So they're great examples of being humble. Daniel's awesome. I love Daniel. And we always, we have a freaking ministry in our church based on those three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So those guys are great examples of being humble. I have here a little thing in my notes to share, but not that I consider myself in the same league as Daniel and Abraham as far as their immediate willingness to submit to God, but most of you know that after high school I didn't really know what I was going to be doing with my life, and when I was 17 or something, I started to come to ABF and started working on my relationship with God, and then not long after that, God opens up this door to Eldership Academy. And I definitely knew that I played some role in that. I didn't really know what that meant. And to be honest, I'm still sort of figuring that out, But I'm standing here right now. And so, God opens up this door and he calls me, or he calls us, and we're supposed to go, But there's other people who have to, I guess, learn it the hard way, so to speak. Verse 8 says, purify your hearts. So humility isn't a flippant thing, or that, the act of being humble isn't a flippant thing. It's not, whoops, I messed up, or, it's not an outward dealing of our actions. Outward dealing of our actions, yeah. Humility is contrition, and this takes place in our heart. Let's read verse 9 again. It says, let there be tears for what you have done. Let there be sorrow and deep grief. Let there be sadness instead of laughter and gloom instead of joy. When you first read that, it's kind of depressing. It's it doesn't make you feel good at all, which a lot of people want, but yeah, it's kind of a sad thing, but it's true. When we realize who we are in God, and when we are critical, and when we're analyzing those why questions, Colin was talking about, if we realize that what we're doing isn't in line with Christ, this should weigh on us. This type of sorrow, this godly sorrow, should weigh on us. Yeah, humility, like I said, it's not an outward dealing of your actions. It's not Adam in the garden and hiding because of his guilt, and it's not Judas hanging himself because of his guilt, you know. That's not contrition. Contrition seeks to like change, and it feels the weight of how we are and how we're acting, and it seeks like it's an R word. Reconciliation, resolution, like, yeah, it seeks that, and it craves that, and that doesn't look happy, I guess, you know. It would be unjust if we didn't, go back to Peter and Jonah, but Peter, known for denying Christ, you know, Christ is resurrected and visits Peter again, and Peter is eager to be, that's the word, restored. Restored was the word I was looking for. Peter is eager to be restored by Christ, you know. Christ asks him 3 more times, you know, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? But Peter is eager to be restored by Christ. I kind of think of it like a dog, you know. Bear with me. Like a dog, when you scold a dog, and this is why dogs are awesome, but you scold a dog, and what does the dog do? It like bows its head and like tail between the legs, and it comes towards you, like looking to be restored, you know? You pet a dog on the head, and all of a sudden it's like you're his best friend, and it's your, you know, whatever. You're his best friend again, and it loves you again, and I don't know if that's a weird example, but it totally reminds me of that, you know? Jonah, he's in the belly of this fish, and let's read it. Let's read Jonah, I think it's chapter 2. Jonah 2, if you want to flip, or you can just listen. Then Jonah, let me take a drink. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from inside the fish. He said, I cried out to the Lord in my great trouble, and he answered me. I called to you from the land of the dead. And Lord, you heard me. You threw me into the ocean depths, and I sank down to the heart of the sea. The mighty waters engulfed me. I was buried beneath your wild and stormy waves. Then I said, O Lord, you have driven me from your presence. Yet I will look once more toward your holy temple. I sank beneath the waves, and the waters closed over me. Seaweed wrapped itself around my head. I sank down to the very roots of the mountains. I was imprisoned in the earth, whose gates locked shut forever. But you, O Lord, snatched me from the jaws of death. As my life was slipping away, I remembered the Lord, and my earnest prayer went out to you. It's your holy temple. Those who worship false gods turn their backs on all of God's mercy. But I will offer sacrifices to you with songs of praise, and I will fulfill all my vows, for my salvation comes from the Lord. And then it goes on to say that, you know, Jonah does exactly what God commanded him. You know, he goes into this scary town, Nineveh, where they're like known for like, you know, killing their prisoners and whatnot. But he goes there, and he fulfills God's like call to him. But yeah, while Jonah's inside this fish, he feels just the weight of his actions, you know, and he cries out to God, it says. I didn't mention it before, but after Peter rejects Christ 3 times, it says Peter wept bitterly, you know. Just visualize that, or think about it, you know, it's a recognition of Peter knowing how he's, I keep wanting to use, it's a recognition of how Peter messed up. How do I struggle with contrition? Josh likes to call me like a soldier, you know. That's the term he likes to use for me. But, you know, and as good as that is at times, that has come at a cost for me, you know. I'm not known for being very contrite, and it's probably one of the biggest things I need to work on, and and I struggle with like empathy and appreciation of things and what goes into certain things and stuff. And so, yeah, I struggle very much with contrition and appreciating that in my relationship with people. But yeah, being humble is recognizing is who we are in God. At the end, it says, "Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will lift you up in honor." It says the same thing. Christ says the same thing in Matthew. You know, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who are humble will be exalted. But we're living in a time, you know, Alex commented on it the other day. We're living in a time where, like, at every turn of our head, even, we're like being called to act a certain way or do something, you know. Yeah, we're being tempted just at every turn. But if we're truly friends with Him, and if we're truly seeking to be close to Him, then this has to be like an active attitude we're having. You know, it can't be passive. It has to be something we're actively analyzing about ourselves and actively seeking to grow in. You know, this contrition and this being humble and not proud. We shouldn't be, like Colin said, we shouldn't be, for those of you that, you know, did think about it, whether you shared or not on the thread, we shouldn't be making excuses for the things we do. You know, like, I feel like I'm picking on your parents, so whatever. It's relevant, but my father-in-law, you know, says this thing, and Colin cited it also, but he says, like, I go fishing for God or something, you know? He tries to fit what he does yeah, he just tries to justify it, but, you know, he's really sacrificing all these other things for God. So, yeah, contrition and humbleness doesn't look like justifying your actions, you know? I don't know if any of you guys did it, but it shouldn't be going into defensive mode shouldn't be your first thought, you know, like, and when people are like trying to hold you accountable to something, it shouldn't be F you, you know, back up. It should be like you feel the weight of like how you're coming off or what you're doing or what you're not doing or how you're interacting with somebody, you know. That's what contrition is. It's not going into defensive mode. Yeah, and if we're trying to honor our role as the bride of Christ, then we need to live that life. So, as you talk about it in your cell groups, I want you to ask yourselves how you struggle with humility, how you struggle with, you know, living in today's society, you know, glorifying yourself instead of God, lifting yourself up, how you struggle with contrite hearts, you know. I just mentioned, like, what do you do? What's your reaction when someone tries to correct you? Yeah, and do you find yourselves justifying your actions and your thoughts and your interactions? You find yourselves justifying them instead of reflecting on if that's Christ-like. So, yeah, break up into your cell groups and discuss these things, guys.